And I'm going to read my clapboard, which says, The Sophist, Answering Parmenides, Winter 2021, Session 5, The Philosopher's Higher Science of Dialectic. Okay, and I will remind, I just chatted earlier for people who arrived late, just what we're offering next term, which is in more than a month's time, which is Platonism and Christianity on Monday night. In this time slot, Timaeus and Critias, because some people in this group are keen to do that. So if people in this group want to continue our journey, then that's a really interesting one. We get medieval cosmology, we get lots of cryptic mathematics, and we get Atlantis, the myth of Atlantis. And then on the Wednesday night is the introduction, which people are welcome to do or tell your friends about. And then there's also, starting in 2 weeks' time, just in 2 weeks' time, with another school, the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy, Plato's Theory of Forms, and let me know if you're interested in that. Then there's the other thing to mention is next week is our last week, so we'll stop a bit early and bring the tipple of your choice and maybe something to nibble, and we can have kind of a bit of a break up then. Okay, so I'm going to go straight into the reading this week, and I'll have a couple of digressions about some things that come up as we go. And, you know, I hope that's helpful to people, and it might hopefully add something beyond, you know, maybe what some people feel is a bit of a nuanced argument and a bit dry and doesn't feel relevant. So I try and bring that in for us as we go along. But I'll start with, and in doing that, I'll start with the gods and the giants from last week, the materialists and the idealists, and just engage a little bit more with that. And then we'll get into this week's reading. Okay, so we remember the materialists. They claimed that what is real is only really what you can grasp, you know. So a good word in English maybe is tangible. You know, the only things that are real is what I can, you know, touch, you know, things in the world that I can feel and touch, but generally senses, tangible. So the main thing that Stranger wants to do with the materialist position is to get the materialists to acknowledge that existence of some things that are intangible. That, come on, don't you believe the soul exists, and that the soul, there are concepts that the soul knows, such as justice, that these also exist, and yet they are intangible, insensible, but they seem to say that the soul has some sort of shadowy body. Remember that. So they're trying to get out of it. So another strategy he uses is introducing this hypothesis of being as nothing but power, an active or a passive receptive power. Like, if you know your Chinese philosophy a little bit, yin and yang, active and receptive, but with one unity. And as those people who have been following, people have been mentioning this, following Cornford in his Theory of Knowledge. We've got it in PDF for free if you want to have a look at it. And you have the Cornford translation if you have the Cambridge edition. So Cornford explains that actually the Greek dynamis, if I can pronounce it that way, that's where we get dynamic from, and it's wonderful, the connection between dynamis and dynamic, because it works very well for us here. Sometimes those origins don't work well, but in this case it does. So Cornford explains that actually dynamis has this sense already of being ability or being able, but being able in an active way and also in the passive way, passive receptive way. And I'd just like to dwell on this a little bit, because it is important for us to consider when we're engaging with this philosophy, because we have this tendency to think of power from the active side and not from the receptive side. So we need to sort of adjust ourselves a bit for that. So receptive has a power to resist as per a hard or solid thing. You know, a solid thing strongly resists penetration, liquid less so, and gas even less so. So these things, these tangible things, are receptive, but they resist more or less. But the receptive is repulsive in that sense, but also attractive. So think of electromagnetism, attractive and repulsive. Think of a magnet, depending on what poles you put on, attractive and repulsive. And then think of electricity as in, you know, positive and negative charge, and voltage as being a measure of how much attraction and repulsion. So and also we can think of receptive, attractive in nature, in biological nature, as in the orchid, you know, saying to the bee, you know, look at me, you know, come inside me, come in, because I want you to spread my pollen. You can get the honey, but I want you to spread my pollen. So the orchid is saying with its beautiful flower, look at me, trying to get the bee to come. And then there's repulsion in nature, like the frill-necked lizard, you know, puffing up, or the pufferfish, you know, scaring away the predator. And of course, there's sex. And with Plato, as we're starting to realize, a lot of it comes back to sex. Remember that we're working with the sexual metaphor of intercourse. And so sexual attraction and seduction is on this other side. This corresponds more or less with lover and beloved, as in beloved being on the receptive side. And sexual intercourse consists of penetration and receiving. The male in homosexuality, in modern homosexuality, you talk about being on top or being on the bottom. Of course, in heterosexuality, it goes without saying. And then think how sex, and in the sexuality, there's a lot of play around advance and resisting advances, resisting penetration, being easy, playing hard to get, being tight or not tight. Can you see how this works in the seductive, receptive sort of way? And in society, this sexuality is played on in our society with advertising, with the seduction of the male gaze. So this is a power, right? This is a strong power socially. Advertising is replete with seductive, beautiful young women. The masculine response is to be seduced. But what is the female? And men go crazy about this response. You know, they take risks, they spend fortunes, they sail to Troy. So, but the feminine response is to emulate this seduction. That's what advertising is doing. Do this exercise, buy my product, and you'll be seductive like me. You will have my receptive power. So notice how in modern society that there's less prohibition on sexual seduction. And it hasn't always been this way. In European society, we only need to go back to our grandparents, where there was a prohibition on the seductive side, which is much less now, as we know. And in contemporary Muslim societies, seduction is severely suppressed. And this reminds me of traveling in Iran and traveling with some Spanish women. And I said, well, what's it like having to dress like this all the time? And they said, well, I feel like I'm dressing like my grandmother. And so it's exactly like that. It's that the seductive now in our society is okay, but in a lot of society hasn't always been. And so then we think of this power on the masculine active side. Recently in our society, there's been a big effort to rein that power in, and especially in the Parliament House of Canberra. So we're not talking about morality here or taking moral positions about this power. We're just trying to see how it operates, the two sides of this power, and at least recognizing but that the receptive, attractive, or repulsive, that side is also powerful in nature and socially, in its social form. So, okay. So that was my little riff on that one. Something to think about, something to contemplate. Now, the other thing I want to bring up here is to compare this with our form, the form of distinction, same other, where we use the metaphor of the island and the sea. Now, you might remember that I put a caveat on that. You can go back and look at the recordings when I first introduced it, but I put a caveat on that and said, well, actually, this metaphor of island and sea seems to work quite well, right? But it's not helpful for the static form, but it's not helpful for the dynamic. It's not necessarily helpful for the dynamic form. And so we're moving now into form dynamics. In the Sophist, in this section, we're moving to the dynamics of form, the generation of form. In the static form, it's same and other. In form dynamics, it's othering, the becoming other of the same, or remember knotting, odd knotting itself and becoming even knotting itself and becoming odd, that sort of dynamics, othering. So there's the other and the same, and then with the dynamics, there's othering. Here, the active is the same, and the receptive is the other, the not, the nothing. Now, remember Wöhler's void screaming out to be filled. Remember she talked about, oh, there's a space there on the counting board, but it's screaming out to be filled. And I hope Wöhler doesn't mind me using this because this is really helpful for me. It's kind of a bit like a vertigo, isn't it? A desire to enter the void. Remember how the same corresponds to one and the zero to the other. And think of the zero, how helpful it was. The zero was there to say this space inside the zero is empty. Think of the zero signifying the empty space in the middle. And back to Shakespeare's crude metaphor. In Shakespeare's time, the zero was a new thing, right? And people were anxious about it, but he made jokes about it. Like the zero is identified with the vagina, and the one with the penis, the active and receptive. This is helpful for us. Now, to identify the other with the receptive, so with the feminine, seems demeaning to the feminine. But this is only if the receptive is not given its due worth. And I hope I've made an effort here to give it its due worth. We have to recognize this power and see that the power of absence, the power of the void, the screaming void, right? The seductive void is just as important in Plato as it is in Chinese change philosophy, the I Ching. It's just as important, right, as the active. You can't have the one without the other, like in that Tai Chi diagram, the lovely teardrop diagram. And we can talk in the discussion about the correspondences here because they are powerful. With the change, I think it's the same term, the change philosophy of the Chinese, I Ching, the book of change. It's very similar, the Tai Chi with its yin yang inside. Okay, so it's the receptive, it's the void, it's the zero, it's the feminine. But we're not saying it is not, and it is nothing, but it's powerful in its notness. So let's get back to the materialist. The strategy of the stranger with the materialist is this. Remember, the materialist is saying that all that is real is what is tangible. You know, we get people in our society saying that. That's kind of like the popular version of what materialism is, an interest in the tangible. Then we need to persuade them that the mark of the tangible, the characteristic of the tangible that makes it tangible, is this power. That this is what defines material reality. And think about it. Everything that is tangible has either one of these powers. If we can persuade the materialists to admit this, that power, this power we're talking about, is the mark of the tangible, the mark of reality, dynamis, then they might see just the same power in the intangible reality as well. Like, please consider, it's not only tangible things that have power, so does justice. And we might consider the power of justice. And we might go back to the Phaedo, as Jackie was suggesting, and Socrates' analysis of why he's sitting there in the prison. Remember, he was having a go at Anaxagoras, who was saying, oh, well, let's bring it back to the root cause, the physical account, the muscles and the bones and the sinew. But a better account is the political account. The judicial system of Athens put him there. Social, political power. This is easy for us because when I say, for example, let's start talking about power in Melbourne, in this city, you might just by me saying that immediately think I'm meaning political power, social power. What's the power structure of Melbourne? Who's important, right? You are not thinking I'm thinking of power as in energy, pushing and pulling and so on. So in our language, we can see that power is also there in intangible things. And this is what the strange is trying to do with the materialist, the phantom of the materialist, because he's not actually, no materialist is actually standing in front of him. Anyway, he does that. And then this is settled, right? Let's say the materialist is persuaded. And then he moves, holding this idea of power, he's moving to the idealist. The idealist says the polar opposite. All that is real is insensible and also unchanging, right? So with the idealist, there's the Platonic division between being and forms and becoming sensible things. Yes, we have intercourse with both. Intercourse with becoming is through the bodily senses. Intercourse with being is through the soul. But it's only the intercourse with becoming, according to the idealist, which involves the power of action and being acted upon. This is challenged in our dialogue by the stranger. But surely knowing is an action. So knowing of forms is an activity involving power. And if it's an activity involving power, then it must be change. There must be change in the knowledge of being. The soul knows active, real being is known receptive. This means that real being, formal reality, changes. The receptive changes by receiving the active, if knowledge is power. But the idealists would protest. That can't be, because the forms never change. And so this can be an interpretation of early Plato's dialogues of the Phaedo, when, you know, there's this talk about going into the realm of the forms and where nothing changes, right? I'd argue that there's other interpretations of that, but let's give people that. That's okay. Let's give people that. Anyway, these idealists, whether it's early Plato or whether it's someone else, or just an imagined group that Plato's made up in order to make his point. The idealists would process and say, knowing, well, if you say that knowledge is power and that it has the active receptive and therefore the forms are receptive, no, it can't be, because forms don't change. But, says the stranger, at 248e, reality, when it is being known by the act of knowledge, must, in so far as it is known, be changed owing to being so acted upon. So what is he saying here? The act of knowing, the form of nature, the formal nature of reality is like the receptive, the dynamis. It changes. The reality changes in the knowing of it. What does this relate to? Aunt Agatha's chickens, of course. You first experience of the chickens, they're just a bunch of chickens. Then you get to know them. You perceive the differences. Make distinctions in your experience of the chickens, and the chickens change to being distinct chickens that you can name. They're all different. How come I didn't notice that when I arrived? Think of language. Think of when you first heard a language that you'd never heard before. It's a wall of sounds. Then you learn the language. You make the distinctions in your experience. Your experience of those sounds changes. Active is making distinctions, knowing, receptive. Oh, sorry, what you know is receptive. It's being distinguished. This is distinctions change. Your reality, your experience changes through your observation of it. So you don't have to jump to Heisenberg, his paradox of observation in quantum physics, if people know that, where observation changes the object, right? You don't have to jump to that, because here it is in Plato, and here it is in Aunt Agatha's chickens. Your experience, your knowing of the chickens, of the language, of the sounds of the language, whatever, changes your experience, changes your formal reality. So it's a very important point. It's different for the materialist view, the conventional view of knowing. So,
can I just? I'm a little concerned about that.
Sure.
I think the knowing as an action is closer to the materialist view of knowing, because for the idealist, wouldn't knowing be a state of being, i.e., it won't be. It's a state of being rather than an action, because you just know. We've always known, we're just aware of the knowing. So it's a state of being. And it refers more to what the idealists are concerned about, and that's the unchanging, intangible world. Whereas the way you've just said it, it might not be exactly as the materialist outline it, but it is akin to the materialist view, and it ignores the idealist view of just knowing as a state of being, an awakeness, an awareness.
Okay, so with the idealist, I think, yeah, he's absolutely challenging the idealist and saying there is change in your formal experience, right? So he's saying there is change in that way.
The examples that you gave all pertain to the material element, not to the intangible element. So it's a little bit circular, the argument.
Which is the material element?
Well, you've said about anything that we touch, anything we perceive, you know, the auntie's chickens, all of those in the material world.
Okay, you're saying that's... That's materialist. Well, the distinction of the chickens is a form, isn't it? Like if you say you distinguish the chickens, you have the experience and you say, they're chickens over there, right? You have the experience of the form of chickens in your experience, right? But then you make distinctions. You make the distinctions of the 6 separate chickens that she's got, and you give all those distinctions names. They're forms. Each chick, that's a form, right? So that, I guess that's a good question, I suppose, because I didn't really emphasize that. So it's your formal experience that's changing there, because you just kind of group them all together. They're all chickens. I can't tell the difference. And then you make the distinctions. You say, this is that chicken, and this is Fluffy, not Betsy. You know, this is you know, a Blackie, not Spotty. I don't know. You know, you're making the distinction in the formal reality. So anyway, we can discuss this further in the discussion. But thanks for bringing that up. I think that is a good thing. Effie, thanks for that. So anyway, but then the stranger then adds, well, come on, for heaven's sake, do you really think that ideal reality is so changeless? So he's saying to these formalists, as hail hits my roof, I hope you can still hear me. He's saying to these idealists, I mean, consider life, right? Consider psyche, right? Consider understanding itself. Are you saying that these obvious dynamic things, I mean, life, psyche, understanding, it's dynamic, are you saying that they have no place in this reality of yours? Are you saying that this formal reality stands aloof and solemn, devoid of intelligence? Can we say it has intelligence, but no life? The formal reality of the friends of the forms is here portrayed as dead, if you like, set in stone. That's not a confusing metaphor. It's kind of dead, it's just set, it's not changing. Reality is not a living realm. The real of the friends of forms is attacked as being lifeless and dead. And the stranger is saying, come on, guys. It's not lifeless and dead. It has soul, it has change, it has life. Surely there must be living, it must be dynamic, also in this receptive way. Surely life and soul and understanding are in the realm of the ideal real, and they surely involve change. So in this way, the stranger insists that the idealists should concede, right? He just insists on it. So it must be conceded that changing, things changing, and change itself are real and in the formal realm. Okay, so the stranger doesn't want to go too far the other way, right? He doesn't want to say all is change. And here we come back, for those people who did Theaetetus, come back to this thing between Parmenides, nothing changed, and the Heracleans, right? Have a look, if you want, back on page 182, right? If you say that there are things, static, that change, that's okay. So there is static and dynamic. But if you say that it's only dynamic, that there's nothing that changes, which pretty much Plato says is a contradiction, there must be something that changes. But if you say there's nothing that changes, then there's no object, which is absurd. But anyway, if there's nothing that is being changed, there's nothing static at all, then there's nothing to know. Okay, so it's pretty much the Theaetetus argument. So where does this leave us? So we've got, on one side, we've got the Heracleans say no change, and Parmenides says there's change. Well, it's kind of a bit like, the child when you say, well, look, I got a sweetie here and I'm going to put it in one hand, you know, like which hand? Which hand? Change, unchange. Which is it? Can I have an answer? Which is it going to be in the formal realm? Which is it going to be, change or unchanged? Both. So he's kind of, this is his compromise we were talking about last week. And indeed, this was going to be the new definition for being. But hang on a sec. Of course, both change and unchange are exist. And so it brings us back to this underlying being, which is behind change and unchange. So yeah, so what else should I say about that? Yeah, so now they come to that complete perplexity of about being, what is being and what is not being. And so he says, well, at least we know that not being participates equally in this perplexity. Being participates in this perplexity as well as not being. And that's the end of last week's reading. So I hope that reflection on that reading was helpful. And I'm interested in talking about what Effie was talking about, discussing that, and also discussing the notion of a dynamic, the two sides of dynamic, active and receptive, and anything else that caught people's notice, or if there was anything I missed, or any reflections. So there you go. I'll have a cup of tea and hear what you have to say.
Hi, Bernie. I'll just add one comment to what you're saying. In the Theaetetus, when Theaetetus, he did a lot of work on our square roots. The Greek word for powers and for square roots to exponential, the same word that Bernie was saying is being used here for energy or power. So he may have been making a Pythagorean point, because Plato believed that he was heavily Pythagorean, especially towards the end of his life. He was a kind of a Pythagorean Plato, you could say. So if we talk about 2 to the power of 3, 2 cubed, that's using the same Greek word for power that Plato's using for that. So he could have a mathematical sort of hint somewhere.
Dimension to it, yeah. That's right. Yeah, no, power is important in many different ways. Thanks for that, Andrew.
Andrew, what is the word in Greek that's used?
Dynamis.
Sorry?
Dynamis, if I pronounce it correctly. Dunamis, dynamis.
Oh, dynamis. Dynamis, yeah.
Yeah, it's probably the modern Greek has a descendant from it.
Yeah.
Well, that's English as well. You know.
Like you were saying before, it is used in mathematics at school.
Sorry?
We were using that word in mathematics at school, dynamis.
Yeah, so it's where power comes from. That's right. It's where power comes from. As in 2 squared, 2 to the power of 2. That's where if you read ancient Greek Pythagorean textbooks, you'll see that there. And it's a sense that a line, say a line that's too long, has the power of the plane, which is 2 squared. So it's kind of this notion of generation. It has the power, and then it has a power, the second power of 2 cubed, that sort of thing. Yeah, so dynamis, and then it's used in modern science in a very similar way. I mean, and it's used actually in stuff I'm involved in about the dynamics, form dynamics. it's used in exactly this way as well in the writing on form dynamics. I've written a paper on form dynamics, a few papers on form dynamics, and dunamis is used, dynamic is used in exactly this dunamis way.
So I'm curious to know what Effie was saying. I was kind of getting it. I was a little lost, but I think, can you just repeat what you were saying, Effie, and just because I'm curious about that point of view.
It kind of made sense when Bernie finished and said, well, it's both. And I was just a little bit concerned about the way that knowing was described as an action rather than a state of being. And that by describing it as an action, you're placing it not directly with the materialist, different to the materialist, but akin to it. Whereas you're really putting it in opposition of the idealist, because the idealist thinks about the unchanging, the real is unchanging and intangible, and so knowing for them would be a state of being, an awareness, like just knowing. It's not active.
Do you mean not active? You mean not, for the idealist, it's not active?
Yeah, but not like the Gita would say inactivity and activity is the same thing, because by being inactive is just another form of action, really, right? So not in that materialist sense. Whereas if you believe everything is not changing and intangible, then knowing is just a state of being. I suppose that's why people meditate, because they go into that state of being of knowing. Maybe, I'm not sure. So yeah. I just felt like it was placing knowing, even though it looked like it was opposing both, it was really making it akin to, for a moment there, I thought that.
Akin to the materialist point.
Yeah.
Viewpoint. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, yep, sounds good. I mean, on that issue, can you see Plato's point of view, where knowing, as in making distinctions, doing the dialectic, like learning a language or something, how that is active, and how the formal nature of reality is receptive and changing. So it's kind of two sides of the same thing, really. But he's
in the Meno, where Socrates gets the slave boy is not being active, but he's being acted upon. So they're acting upon the slave boy, and therefore his state of being becomes one of awareness. Am I reading too much into it?
Well, I'm just wondering why you would say the slave boy is not being active.
He's being acted upon, like Socrates is directing him, and that's why. Well, that's how I always saw it. So I could be wrong. It was just a presumption I made.
Do you think the slave boy learns? Learns through the activity?
He wasn't learning anything. He was just remembering. So his state, it wasn't an action. It was an awake. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Just forgive me.
No, well, it's good to think about.
Yeah. Or maybe I'm just confusing it, but I just always thought that true knowing, maybe I'm an idealist, that true knowing is a state of being. It's not something that you pick up in a book or that you can learn or that changes. It's just an awareness. That's the true knowing.
Okay. So if you thought about knowing as in knowing how to speak Greek and learning how to speak Greek, would you be happy with that?
Yeah, but again, you're falling into the trap of dealing with material stuff rather than knowing the intangible. So when you're dealing about the intangible, you can't know it. You can't act to know it. It's an inactive experience. Knowing on that higher realm of the intangible is a state of being.
Yeah.
Whereas knowing things of the material world is active. So you're right, it was both.
Yeah,
I
no,
wanted
I
both too.
totally agree with you now, and that does relate to Platonism in the apophatic, the denial method, the method of negative theology, or coming to the higher truth by actually unlearning. Nicholas of Cusa's book is called The Doctrine of Ignorance or something. It's actually unlearning to get to that higher truth. So yeah, that's a good one to point out, Effie, and we'll get to that because there's this amazing connection between in the Republic, where he talks about the form of the good and being beyond all being and knowing, and so therefore nothing, you know, and Parmenides' absolute void. You know, it's kind of like it's like the two extremes come together, and it's probably not worth shouldn't be talked about here because it might confuse people, but that is like that's when you get to that kind of higher level of Platonism, you realize that actually the absolute void is also the source of all.
I think in one respect, it is a weak argument. Probably Effie's right. If someone could have said to the stranger, take a Euclidean circle, a circle like in Euclidean geometry, which didn't exist then, but they had the circle. If you study that circle and acquire knowledge of it, the circle itself never changes. The form of the circle will always remain perfect, no matter how much you learn about it. Your knowledge of the shape, your knowledge of the circle itself changes if you become more aware of the circle. But the circle itself as a form can't be changed by your knowledge of it.
No, absolutely not. And so in that sense, there are statics in the formal realm, and there's dynamic in the formal realm. And when we get to the art of dialectics, we'll get to very much to the dynamic. And so, you know, if I can just riff off that, Andrew, then if you just imagine how many circles you can draw inside circles and draw more circles inside circles, like we did in the first two classes in this course, where we were talking about defining the Sophist and also defining where I live, my address, you know. So there's circles inside circles. And so there's a dynamics there, but what stays constant is the idea of the circle itself, whether it's perfectly circular or whether it's the idea of closure, distinction between inside and outside. So yeah, that's right. So it's both, right? It's change and unchanging. The form of the circle does not change. Perhaps the form of justice does not change, but you know, the arrangement of them can change in your experience.
I think I could even try, although I'd probably fail, but you could almost do it in the scientific left and right brain analysis as well. Whereas, you know, the right brain, you know, if you like, you know, the right brain would be like the lion, you know, focusing on its prey, and the left will be look at the whole landscape. So you'd have more distance from the object while you're working with the left side of the brain, right? So you're more further away from it, so you impact on it less. You know how you said that knowledge impacts on what it's looking at? The further you are, the less you impact, right? Right? Or maybe not.
I think the easiest way to say is that when you learn, let's just say when you learn about the chickens or the language or whatever, you make distinctions. So they're forms, right? Forms of the circle in a way. You make distinctions, and in making those distinctions, your experience changes. Your experience of the forms, your formal reality changes, right? So it's not distance, close or distance. You could be looking at the stars and making distinctions in the stars, you know, like finding the Orion's belt and finding all the zodiac in the stars. You make those distinctions, right? And your experience changes. Next time you go and look at the sky, you have a different experience because you're aware of these arrangements that you weren't before. So it's really that your reality changes. And we'll get to this when we get to the science of dialectic a bit more, when we come to that. And maybe I'll go on and unless anyone's got a pressing question, and then we can have more discussion after this reading. Now, I'll do my best with this. You know, like if you're having problems with some parts of it, don't worry too much about it. It's what you get to at the end, and in a way we're already there. You know, in a way we are already there. But this is the way Plato gets to it. So, you know, relax a bit if it's a problem, or you know, or have a go and see how you go. All right. So there's this thing about the one and the many. You know, it comes up a lot of times in Plato, and it seems to have been a big problem at the time, especially in linguistic analysis. Okay. So let me have a go at this, where we'd say that if I say this woman is rational, it's like I'm saying that not only the woman is woman, but she is also rational, as in she's the equivalent of the rational, you know, like saying she's reason or something. But no, she's a woman and she's reason. The woman is rational, you know, or at least that some part of the woman is the equivalent to rationality. And so there'd be this argument, and it's getting kind of to the skeptics here, where they say, well, only reason is reason, and woman is woman. You know, you can only really say tautologies, right? This is this and that is that. Only tautologies are permitted. One cannot at the same time be many. So the woman can't be rational, tall, thin, rich, friendly, or whatever. The woman can be woman, tallness is tallness, friendliness is friendliness, rich is rich. Now, the strange is dismissive, saying that only silly old men believe this, and he's got some cryptic reference to a particular person, perhaps. However, there's something in this that is relevant to the philosophical debate. So let me have a go at explaining this. This is again going back to this linguistic approach. You know, so Plato's got language pointing to the forms. Linguistic approach is where if I define, imagine if you're defining a word linguistically, right? If you define the word, then you define it by other words. It's kind of like looking up a dictionary. Remember when we tried to do this with justice in the introductory class? Other words can either mean the same or something slightly different. Okay, so we could just use another word for justice, a euphemism for justice, right? Or we could say justice is equality or something else. Okay, but justice isn't exactly equality. There's a way in which equality is different. For example, equality can refer to the equal length of two pieces of wood, right? So justice is the same in some ways as equality, but different in other ways. So, you know, I can say, I could say penis means dick, you know, or dick means penis, or I can say chair, because that's just saying the same thing using a different word, or I can say chair means chaise in French, right? So I'm just doing a translation there. It's just like saying A is A or B is B. You're not saying anything new. But when you try to give a definition that goes beyond that, you're saying something new, but you're saying what it is not, right? Justice is equality. Well, it is in the way that it is justice, but also equality is something else. So you can't say justice is equality, equality is equality, justice is justice. So how do we go with that? This is actually a problem. So what it is that you can't define meaning in this way. You can't ground your knowledge in this way. So you need to ground it by reference, right? And there's two ways to do this. One is the materialist thing, to the cup itself. But remember, there's problems with that. And the other way to ground it is Plato with the forms and the distinctions you make, right? So with the Plato way, it's like, remember, how do you define two? You can't define two. They actually had great problems. Bertrand Russell had great problems defining two. It took him pages and pages to get to the definition of two, and the definition is hilarious. But we define two so easily just by showing, here's two sweets, here's two cups, here's two, all those things participate in two. Okay, so we're grounding our knowledge in that way, which some people might consider illegitimate, but you can't ground it in meaning. So this one and the many thing relates to this problem of saying what one word means by using other words. Anyway, maybe that's interesting, maybe it's not. But those who refused, I'm sorry, but anyway, those who refuse many in one are dismissed, and forms participation in other forms is now proposed. So we're now moving towards a positive position here. So one form can be many forms by, can be many. So one form can be many forms by participation. Remember our diagram with the circles and the circles inside circles? That's what we're talking about. Making the distinctions and distinctions within distinctions when we define the angler or the sophist or whatever. But anyway, he goes through this thing where, well, there's three options, right? Either they don't participate in each other at all to participate in all, or some do and some don't. So they investigate this. First, consider the form of being, the form of existence. It seems to participate in everything. Everything that we say is. Everything that exists participates in being. And this exists, remember, in the broadest sense. This sweet exists, this cup exists, but also justice exists. I am, I exist. Santa Claus exists in a way. Prometheus exists in a way. Anything that I can refer to exists. Now, next consider rest, as in motion and rest, right? A change. So does rest participate in motion? Well, something can't be changing or moving and not moving. Rest and motion at the same time in the same way. These two are perfect contradictions. Either something's at rest or in the same sense it's in motion. Either it's unchanging in one sense or it's changing. It's one or the other. Compare this with Phaedo. Odd and even. Odd can't be even. Even can't be odd. Opposites can't participate their opposite. That's the rule. Something that participates the opposite, like a beautiful thing, remember, can also participate ugliness because it's not perfectly beautiful, but the form can't participate its opposite form, right? So lots of things can participate rest. Being can participate rest, but rest cannot participate motion. So in the case of the form of being, it can participate everything, but in the case of the form of rest, it can't participate everything. So it looks like we have the answer. Remember we had the three options? Nothing participates anything else, all participates all, or some participate in some ways and others don't. So with participation, it's a bit like which hand again. Some do and some don't. And he relates this to the letters of the alphabet. Some go together and some don't. And also some are more essential than others, like the bond. They're bonds, like vowels. They bond the consonants together. And remember this analogy in Theaetetus. There it was about a consideration of the elements of knowledge. And remember that the word for letter is element as a basic component of something. We might say the elementary to electrical circuits to this computer is the switch open and close. It's elementary. right? It's a basic principle, if you like. And so the same with music. If you want to make musical harmony, some notes go together and some don't. For notes in music, as for letters in writing, getting the combinations right is an art. And so too with forms, getting the combinations right is an art. And what is this art or science of forms? And here I paraphrase 253 DE. Have we perchance found the philosopher? How do you mean? The science of dividing according to kinds. I'll use the word kinds. And here he goes through some likes, as in like kinds. One of these would be, in this science, is not to take the same form for a different one. Example, like a kiwi can fly, but it's not a bird. Or taking a different form for the same, right? A different form for the same. Like a whale can swim, but it's not a fish. It's this precise, isn't this precisely, the examples are not Plato's, isn't this precisely the science of dialectic, says the stranger. Those who practice this science can discern clearly one form everywhere extending through many, like the one in the many. E.g., finding the form, so you've got a field of flowers and there's all these different flowers, but you find in the many the form of the orchid, and you distinguish that from the peas and all the other flowers, right? Finding one form everywhere extended through the many, the form of the orchid. And many different forms embraced by, another example is many different forms embraced from without, think of a greater circle, by one form. Like, again, these flowers, there's many different flowers, but they're all one in that they're all flowering plants, embraced by the form of flowering plants. And one form connected in unity through many holes. Here's an example. The form of the mammary glands that you find in all mammals, right? You find the form of the mammary gland in all mammals. One form connected in unity through many holes, all the different particular mammals that you find. And another one, many forms entirely marked off apart. Well, what's that? Many forms entirely, again, biology, all the different species that have distinct breeding, right? They're distinct forms, they breed with each other. The science of dialectic is about knowing how to distinguish in all these ways, kind by kind, like by like, and how some kinds combine and how others do not. And who is the practitioner of this art, this dialectic art? It's the lover of wisdom, the philosopher. And so they've found the philosopher. And this passage relates very strongly to a passage in the Phaedrus on page 265D, where the art of dialectic is accounted in a similar way. And this is a very condensed account of the different practices that you might do in trying to make the right distinctions, right? Thus so, we've defined the philosopher as a practitioner of dialectic, which is the investigation of forms and how they relate to each other. Here and elsewhere, dialectic in the Republic, famously in the Republic, the education of the philosopher, after he'd done all that mathematics, it's just a prelude to the science of dialectic. In the Phaedrus, in the reference I made, it's hailed as the highest, all-encompassing great science. Dialectic is the science of sciences. And there's a warning here, and certainly, as I was saying earlier before we started, there's a warning here that Cornford sounds loudly in his commentary. This is not logic. Logic qua logos. It's only as a correspondence with the forms, right? We are talking about what's going on in the forms. Logic is about the relation. It's, for Plato, it's like grammar, right? It's just grammar, the way you weave all the language together. What we're talking about here is what's going on in the forms, and you connect the forms with the discussion we're having right now, through words, through nouns, through names. Remember we did that, names and the correspondence there. What we're talking about here is not logic. Plato would call that grammar, right? Where you weave nouns and verbs together. The forms have their own elementary rules, rules that go beyond, that are more elementary than the rules of logic. Rules of logic, subject, predicate, this is that, the laws of contradiction, and so on. If you want to see a rave about that, go and read your Cornford, page 263 to 272. It's a long passage between in between the sections of Plato, but he was in a particular environment in Cambridge at his time when logicism, reduction to logic, was huge. So it's quite historically interesting to read. Okay, and then we get this lovely little passage, don't we, where he talks about, okay, so we've defined the philosopher, and he says, you remember we said the sophist was hard to find because he's hiding in the dark of non-being, but the philosopher is hard to find because the philosopher is in this amazing life that it's so bright that it's difficult for ordinary souls to be able to see. And so there's a relationship here, of course, with the allegory of the cave in the Republic, going out of the darkness and into the light and being blinded by the light. So we've found the philosopher, but we shouldn't stop here because we've got to keep continuing and finding the sophists. Okay, and so the stranger then resists the discussion to, restricts the discussion to the most important forms. Okay, and this is where we get, okay, let's focus on being, and let's focus on, I've interchanged using motion and rest, but let's say now unchanging and changing, okay? Do you know what I mean? Okay, and so at 254 DE, each is the same. Oh, he says each is the same as itself and other than the other. So when you define a distinction, it's the same as itself and other than the other. And we see this going way back in Euthyphro with piety. Check out 5D. So there's a very strong connection in the description of forms in Euthyphro and right here in advanced Plato. The form is the same as itself and other than its other. Identity and difference, tautology and contradiction. So he starts off in seeing how these elementary forms relate by noticing how everything is in the form of same and other. So change is other than rest, rest is other than change. Remember, shorter is other than taller, taller is other than shorter. All that stuff we've come across before. Precisely because change itself is itself. So there's this kind of weird contradiction where change participates the same, right? Change is the same as itself and not its other, which is rest. Okay, think about that. So change does participate sameness because it's the same as itself. So all the forms participate this sameness, same enough. So we've got that. change is not the form of being, and so it is not being. So this is now where we're getting into the being of not being. Likewise, change participates being because it is what it is, but it is not being. It's not the form of being. So it's not being in that sense. If you like, it's in the not realm. If you think of the circles, the not realm of being. Now, here we have change participating not being, but we also know that change is, it exists. And so at least change as not the not being of, as not being being, change is not being, it's distinct from being, right? It might be within being, but it's not being itself. Change is. So change is not the form of being, right? So it is in that sense not being, but it is. Change exists. So how are we going? So I'll say that again. In that change is not the form of being, it is not being, but it exists. And so not being exists. At page 256D, he says, this extends to all kinds, right? All kinds. For in all of them, the nature of the other so operates as to make each one other than being. In that any particular thing, right? I got this cup, if you like, let's just talk about things. I got this cup, right? The form of the cup, right? It is itself, right? And it participates being, but it is not the being of being. It's not like the generality of being. A living thing is a living thing. It participates livingness, right? But is not the form of living, principle of living. As for the form of being, it is not the form of motion. So it is not the being of the form of motion. The form of being is not the form of motion. So it is not the being of the form of motion. This is a similar argument to where we were with Parmenides last week. One is, remember Parmenides said one is, and then we expanded it to the sentence, one is existent. One is existent, it is. And we noticed that the subject of the sentence one exists independently from the predicate, its existence. And so it also is. It is independent of the being of being. And, oh, sorry, it's independent of being. And so being must lack this being of the one. Okay, it's getting highly convoluted here, hang in there. If the form of being is not the form of motion and also not the form of one, it is also not the form of justice, not the form of the sophist, not the form of whatever. It is not any of these because it is what it is. All these forms all participate in being, but they are not the form of being. And so they are not being of being. So being has not being, and not being has being. There is a distinction here between the opposite of being and the other of being. So it's a bit of a language problem here, but what he's trying to say is there's the opposite of being and the other of being. Where opposite means absolute non-being. Now, remember when we were talking about absolute non-being, it can't be said, right? But when we're talking about not being here, it's all relative to the being of something or to the form of being itself. Remember we said it's relative. Nothing void or whatever is relative. Go back to that we did earlier in this course. Remember the absolute void, and that Parmenides is it right? You should not speak of it, right? But Parmenides' absolute non-being is not what we're talking about here. And that is not what is relevant to the question of the sophist saying what is false. So this was the hurdle we were trying to get over in solving the sophist. The sophist is saying what is false. The sophist is saying what is other to the truth. If the sophist is saying that the unjust is just, then he's referring to the unjust and declaring it just. But notice what he's referring to is the not being of justice. He's only referring to the other of justice, which also is. And so the problem is solved. Hooray, hooray. And I'll just read some passages here, which might be helpful. This is from Cornford's translation, so most of you will have this. You see then that in our disobedience of Parmenides, we have trespassed far beyond the limit of his prohibition. This is 258c. In what way? In pushing forward on our quest, we have shown him results in a field which he forbade us even to explore. How? He said, you remember, never shall this be proved. I'm using a different translation to last time I said it, but never shall this be proved that things that are not are. But keep back thy thought from this way of inquiry. Never say that what is not is. Yes, he said exactly that. Whereas we have not merely shown that things that are not are, but we have brought to light the real character of not being. We have shown that the nature of the different has existence and is parceled out over the whole field of existing things with reference to one another, and of every part of it that is set in contrast to that which is. We have dared to say that precisely that is real, that which is not. And he goes on, then let no one say that it is the contrary of the existent that we mean by what is not. When we make bold to say that what is not, when we make bold to say what is not actually exists. So far as any contrary of the existent is concerned, we have long ago said goodbye to the question whether there is such a thing or not, and whether any account can be given of it or none whatsoever. There he's talking about absolute void, absolute nothing. We've given that away. We must accept our statement that the kinds blend with one another, that existence and difference pervade all and pervade each other. And so that brings us to the apparent triumph that is the end of our reading this week. And I'm exhausted. So any comments or reflections or questions on that? Or I can try to explain what's going on there.
Well, thank you for that, Bernie.
How did you go with it, Kula? Oh, you're on mute, Kula.
Very interesting, but very challenging.
Okay. I mean, the way we've approached this from the beginning, from the very first class, really is as the other in the same, as the island and the sea, as this idea that when we think of a distinction, whether it's a physical thing or whether we think of it as a concept like justice, the other is there in the background. It's like background and foreground. The other is there, and the other is just as real and as important as the same. And the interaction of other and same in our reality, in our experience, is important and something to become aware of. So Plato's gone through this, you know, going through Parmenides' prohibition and particular debates that was going on at that time. But this is what it's really bringing us to. So, you know, I hope that helped you understand it and see where, you know, in a way I kind of delivered this to you on the first day to help today work a bit better. So hopefully it has.
It has helped, Bernie, and I don't know if I've interpreted it correctly, but I find it helpful to think of it in this way, that when we say something is not, so something is not beautiful or is not justice, we're merely saying it's different from, not the opposite of.
Well, it could be two things actually. He makes that particular difference with being, because then it's the absolute non-being. But there's two ways that something can be not something, right? So that's quite easy to explain actually. You say, okay, so you've got justice, and then the opposite to justice is injustice, right? So injustice is not justice in the sense that it's perfect opposite. But then our beauty is the form of beauty, and the form of beauty is not the form of justice, right? So there's a distinction between beauty ugly, justice injustice. They're distinct, as so many other different forms are distinct. And so what he was trying to do when he was going through all that, what the science of dialectic is saying, well, you've got to work out what are the opposites and define them well, you know, define that distinction where you've got one and the other. And then you've got to see how everything relates to each other. I mean, it's quite clear that, well, maybe it's not, right? But the form of beauty is distinct, is not the form of justice, but it's not the opposite to justice. No. This comes up.
Sorry.
No.
If you say something is not beautiful, are you necessarily saying it is ugly?
Exactly not. And this comes up because we're doing platonic love on the other night, and some of you have done that. And I'll just remind you, there's an example of this in there where the Diotima speech. So Diotima teaches Socrates, a young man, everything he knows about love, right? If you haven't done it, it's basically the setting. And so you've got this goddess-like figure. And now what was it again? Was it that, that's right, that saying that love is not a god, eros is not a god. And Socrates then says, oh, well, then is eros immortal? You know, he must be immortal because that's the opposite. And then Diotima says, no, he's a daemon, you know, an angel or spirit or whatever. So, when she says that, she uses that example that you brought up there, Kula, and you might be subconsciously or consciously reflecting on it. She says, do you say that everything that is not beautiful is ugly, right? No, you don't, because justice is not beautiful. So there's two senses of not going on there. One is opposite and one is just, yeah, tell me what word you want to use for that. But yeah, it's another distinction. It's another binary opposite, yeah. So yeah, great example. And thanks for the question. That helps everyone. I'm interested to know if that was useful, and if anyone, you know, like, can see what he's getting at.
I found it very useful, and I was confused with the reading, but it feels a little bit, just one little step closer.
Oh, great.
Yes, the same here.
Okay.
Thank you.
How did you go, Martha? Or are you not near the microphone? Oh, it's okay. You look like you're sick or something. No, you're relaxing. Okay, how'd you go, Helen and John? There you go. Is it working?
Much better now. 10 minutes ago, forget about it.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
So is the example of biological distinctions, you know, and the whole, is that biological examples helpful? I don't know. That's kind of like a scientific system that's really using what he's introducing here, because this is the first time, right? Someone introduced something like this, and it's introducing as very elementary.
Yeah, the first part when you were talking got really, I was lost, but you just brought it together, which was good. So yeah,
Oh,
sort of with it now too.
Okay. All right. So, any questions or comments? Particular things in the reading that stood out? All right. Well, like I've talked a lot today. I think next week there's not so much content. Next week is kind of like, this is like the climax of the dialogue. It's kind of like the climax of Theaetetus and Sophist as a pair, well, and then the three in a way, the statesmen as well. And also, you know, the triangle I had coming back up from Parmenides. This is where you go down to the skepticism of Parmenides, and come up to this part of the Sophist and answer this question that Parmenides posed. You know, well, challenge Parmenides. Metaphorically kill Parmenides. You're wrong, Parmenides. So that's the climax. Next week is a bit of a denouement, but there's good stuff there. So we get on with defining the Sophist as a faker, and then it's a creative art. And then incidentally, we talk about creation as in, we might think of it as natural creation, as in, you know, what's talked about when we talk about Darwinian evolution, you know, how things change in nature and that sort of thing. So we get this notion of creation from nothing. And now that we know what's going on with same and other, we can interpret that in a sophisticated way, which most people misunderstand. Okay, so that's there as well. And so, yeah, so there's lots of good stuff next week. But it's a bit lighter. This was the heaviest. And we will have a glass of wine at the end, and we all deserve it because this has been really hard going. I'm not sure whether I'll teach this again. It was quite a challenge to try and make sense of it for everyone. So yeah, congratulations for getting this far. And I'll turn off the recording now, and do stay around and grab a glass of wine if you like, and we can have a chat if you like, more casually after I turn the recording off. Okay, see ya.